Well, let's go ahead and get the jurors in, and let me then also deal with one aspect.
There's some, you're talking about the defendant?
I'm with the defendant, hold on of the jurors, the defendant, it is late in the afternoon, so. All right, I need the defendant first, and then we'll talk about, some of the jurors are still outside smoking, so I need to, but I'd like to use this opportunity to talk to you about this transcript issues, okay? Do we need to wait for General Crouch? All right, well, what I wanted to do is just point to a couple of things. When I went through the transcript that we were talking about earlier last night and then this morning, there were a couple of things that caught my eye that I wanted to just touch base to make sure everyone's on the same page. On page 83 of the transcript, if you have it handy, page 83 of the transcript, and then continuing to page 84, and I notice in this redacted one, it has Mr. Wiggins on page 83, line 25 says, I got a bunch of violations against me on, and then Agent Neese says, how much paper are you on? 5, 10, 3, Agent Neese 18, Mr. Wiggins, yeah, and they're all consecutive. That is still in the transcript, and I just wanted to, I understand there's a theory that that's the basis upon which he did not want to be taken into custody. And I'm fine to leave it in there if everyone else is, but I wanted to make sure we all are on the same page. All right, being no other discussion about that, on page 85, there was some question about whether the statement made, I understand that last part, and it coming right after out the first part of Mr. Wiggins' statement, but then he said, I've had people try to pull things on me, and Agent Neese says, I understand that last part, I got you. It gets risky, especially this day and age, so you carry a gun. That part, I don't think there's really any issue, but I had flagged it just to make sure we're all on the same page. And again, on page 100, lines 14 through 15, it talks about, because I know I've got 2 active warrants on me, that's the only question I have about that.
Your Honor, that was, I don't have an issue with that. I mean, that was wasn't stated in the opening statements.
All right, I just wanted, again, this is just for clarity's sake and to make sure that we're all on the same page. So I'm not suggesting they should be omitted, I'm just wanting to make sure they were discussed. Page 106 and lines 8 through 14, I had looked, there was some information there about the 22, it was a different gun, it was a 22 revolver. Agent Scarborough then says, okay, and Agent Neese says that you pulled on her. Mr. Wiggins says, yeah.
Your Honor, I'm sorry, Your Honor. We had agreed to redact that entire page.
Okay, so 106 is going to be redacted.
Yes, Your Honor.
All right, I'm just going by what you said was the one that you had agreed upon, and so that's fine. Page 113, lines 9 through 11, regarding, again, warrants. And the same thing, Mr. Evans, you're okay with that? Page 113, 9 through 11. Basically says the reason I've been packed up to move out of state is because when y'all raided my house looking for me on warrants. I don't have any problems leaving it in, I just wanted to bring it to everyone's attention so it was not overlooked, so.
No issue.
All right, same thing with 19 through 22, about him packing up to go out of state. And on page 116, lines 22 through 23, which says you were running, no issues with any of that, correct?
No issue.
All right, then those are my only concerns about wanting to make sure that the transcript is correct. And with those, I think you solved the big one, which was that one page you said was just going to be omitted. Are we ready? I think the jury was still trying to get them all back together. Is that right? All right, they're all up, then we're ready to bring them in. Are we ready? Let's bring them in. Mr. Wyatt, can I see you, Mr. Evans, for a moment?
Hey, Judge, sorry, we got locked out in the building. There's more people that locked out, so.
We only let people in that we want to have in, so I don't know what that's inferring to you. But,
I actually asked him to do it, so.
there was just one page here that this one, when we were I assume a copy of this going to be given to the jury, or I'm just going to have them handle it. You're going to play this as audio or those in this one? All right, ladies and gentlemen, I would just remind you of what we had an old judge that I used to practice in front of, and he used to always tell me when I'd get up to argue about something, and he'd say, don't ask for something you're not sure you want because you might get it. So you asked to go late tonight. We're going to see how far we can get in this case. So, State may call your next witness.
Your state calls Agent Heather Hammond.
Heather Hammond. You need anything? Is it still going to let you finish tomorrow? You have a phone in this courtroom, you need to turn it off unless you happen to be one of the media representatives that's allowed to use their phone. But if the phone's going off, make sure it is silenced. Raise your right hand, please, ma'am.
You solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you give in this case be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Mr. Wyatt, you may ask.
Thank you, Your Honor. Good afternoon, Agent.
Good afternoon.
If you would just make sure you scoot up and speak into the microphone for us.
Yes, sir.
If you would, state your name for the record, please.
My name is Heather Hammond,
If you would, spell your last name, please.
Hammond.
Thank you. Agent, who are you employed by?
I'm currently employed with the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation in the Nashville Crime Laboratory.
And how long have you been with the TBI Crime Lab?
I've been with the TBI since 2015.
Prior to that, what did you do for a living?
Prior to that, I worked at Aegis Sciences Corporation, and before that, I had gone to school for forensic science.
So while we are discussing your educational background, what sort of degree or any degrees that you may have?
I have a Bachelor's of Science degree in forensic science from Middle Tennessee State University.
Do you have any professional affiliations?
Yes, I am a member of the International Association for Identification, and I'm also a member of the Tennessee Division of the International Association for Identification.
Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Agent, do you recognize that document?
Yes, I do.
What is that document?
This is a copy of my CV.
And of particular note, down at the bottom of the second page, have you taught any courses in this
Yes.
area? What have you taught in the past?
I've taught latent print courses at MTSU, or Middle Tennessee State University, as well as courses through the Tennessee IAI as far as their student day is concerned.
Thank you. Your Honor, I asked if the CV made the next exhibit in this trial.
Exhibit 184.
Yes, sir.
Now, Agent, within the TBI Crime Lab, what area do you specialize in?
I specialize in latent prints.
And how long or how much experience do you have with latent prints?
I started in latent prints in 2015, so it'd be the whole time that I've been there.
What sort of training did you receive in order to perform your job?
During my time starting with the TBI, I completed a course with the TBI working side by side with court qualified examiners, processing evidence for the presence of latent prints, being able to develop those latent prints, compare submitted and developed latents to known impressions, and writing reports based off of results. During that time, I also read a lot of books and journal articles on the premise of latent prints. I also gave presentations, did proficiency tests, and I also qualified as far as a mock trial is concerned. After that, I have continued my education in latent prints by taking courses outside of the TBI, and I've also done a presentation as a speaker for research at an international conference.
Thank you. Outside of your jobs in latent examinations, what other functions do you perform with TBI?
With the TBI, I'm also a member of the Violent Crime Response Team.
And what do you do as part of the VCRT?
On the VCRT, I am the latent print examiner on the scene.
Your Honor, the state would tender Agent Hammond as an expert.
No objection.
She'll be tendered as an expert, she'll be qualified rather by the court as an expert on latent prints. Thank you.
Thank you, Your Honor. Now, on May 30th of 2018, did you respond to Dixon County as part of the VCRT?
Yes, sir, I did.
If you would, kind of tell the jury what you learned and then what you did as you got here into Dixon County.
Upon arriving at the TBI, I was briefed by Laura Bowes about a crime that had happened. We were told that there was two scenes, they were a mile apart. I'm just reading from my notes, if that's okay.
Best you can from your recollection would be preferred.
Okay, that there was two scenes, they were about a mile apart from each other. There was an initial scene where a traffic stop had happened, and then there was another scene where there was a police vehicle with the police officer inside, and that the vehicle had been attempted to be burned.
Which scene did you respond to specifically?
The first scene that I responded to was the vehicle. I'm sorry, the burned vehicle.
Thank you. Once you arrived at that particular scene, what did you do?
At that particular scene, the very beginning of it was just getting a briefing from one of the agents that was on the scene. and then being able to get down to that scene to kind of see what was going on. At that point, I was pulled away to go to the scene where the original traffic stop had taken place. And at that point, I transferred over to that scene and did videotaping.
While you were on the scene of the Tidwell Switch and Sam Vineyard Road, did you do any collection of evidence or anything of that nature?
At that scene, I do not believe that I did.
Now, as part of your work on this particular case, did you ever collect any evidence in this case?
Yes, sir, I did.
If you would, tell us where you collected it, where it was collected from, and those sorts of things.
Sure. So to begin with, while I was at the scene of the police vehicle, I was able to develop a latent print on the outside of the vehicle. I took photographs of that latent print, and then I also lifted that print and brought that back in for evidence. From there, I believe that was the only thing that I collected on the scene. Everything else was collected, that I collected was from the Saturn once it was back in TBI custody at the lab.
Thank you. Your Honor, may I approach the witness?
You may.
Agent, do you recognize that photograph?
Yes, I do.
Is that the same photograph that's on the screen here?
Yes, sir, it is.
If you would describe, from your perspective, the significance of this particular photograph.
This would be how the vehicle was found minus the canopy that's over the top of it. There is, the front driver's door is closed, the back driver door is open, and Sergeant Baker is inside and outside of the vehicle.
Thank you. Now, a moment ago, you spoke of collecting latent prints from that scene, correct?
Yes, that's correct.
Could you describe for the jury where you collected those prints from?
Sure. So the print that I collected on this vehicle is, if you're looking at the open door, as close to where it folds into the front driver door, up close to where the window is.
If you would, please feel free to stand up and go point at the screen if that would help the jury understand exactly what you're speaking of.
It was in this area here.
Thank you. But hand you this and see if you can identify it.
Yes, I can.
If you would, tell the jury what that is.
So this is latent lifts and a CD of the latent lifts from that vehicle, from that lift.
Very good. Thank you. Your Honor, I'll ask that that be moved as the next exhibit.
185.
Now, I'm going to circle back and talk about your examination here in just a moment. Now, let's skip ahead in a little bit, and let's talk about anything that you may have collected from the 98 Saturn while it was at TBI headquarters in the laboratory.
Is it okay if I look at my notes for this?
I have no problem with it.
Any objection to a refreshing of memory from the notes?
No, Your Honor.
Agent, you may refresh your memory from your notes.
Thank you, sir. So as far as the inventory that was done on the Saturn, there were specific pieces that were collected. Specifically, there was a cartridge case that was found on the front passenger floorboard. There was a cartridge case found in the glove box. A projectile that was found on the front driver's floorboard, a cartridge case from the front driver's seat, and a cartridge case from the driver's rear floorboard.
All right, so we'll start talking about these individually. If you would identify what's marked for the laboratory as 59A.
Yeah, Exhibit 59A is a cartridge case from the front passenger floorboard of the Saturn.
Thank you. Stand up here. If that could be made the next exhibit.
186.
Exhibit 60A is the cartridge case from the glove box of the Saturn.
187.
Thank you. This one.
This is 61A, and this is the projectile from the front driver floorboard of the Saturn.
188.
62A.
62A is a cartridge case from the front driver's seat of the Saturn.
63A. Thank you.
63A is a cartridge case from the driver rear floorboard of the Saturn.
That one will be 190.
Thank you. And then 66A.
And 66A is a cartridge from the ashtray in the front passenger floorboard of the Saturn.
That will be 191.
Now, Agent, just to be clear, you simply collected these specific exhibits, correct?
That is correct.
Did you do any testing on them?
No, I did not.
Thank you. Does another agent with TBI perform that testing?
Yes.
Thank you. Ask you this and see if you recognize what that is and if you collected it.
This says that it's pliers, let's see, the exhibit number is 142A. These are pliers from the driver's side floorboard of the Saturn, and I did not collect these.
If you would, Agent, tell me on the package who in fact did collect those.
It looks like the original seal is from SC, which I believe would be Shelly Carman.
Thank you. I'll take that back. You take that one down. And then if I could see previously admitted exhibit, 177.
This is exhibit 95A, and this is cell phone parts from the driver's floorboard of Ford.
Did you conduct an examination on that particular device?
Yes, sir, I did.
All right. Now, this isn't the only item that you tested, is that correct?
No, sir, it's not.
So, to make this a little bit easier, let's go through what we have as exhibits to this, and let's talk about briefly what was tested and what you could not find any identifiable prints on. So we'll start with the top. Did you test item 11A, the key card?
Yes, sir, I did.
Were there any identifiable prints?
No, there were not.
And then for 12A,
I did test 12A, and there was no latent print ridge detail.
14A,
14A, I tested, and there was no latent print ridge detail.
and then items 21, 22, and 23A?
21, 22, and 23A, I did test, and there was no ridge development and no identifiable ridges.
Okay. So now that you've brought up the terms, like ridge elements, if you would, describe for the jury what you're looking for when you actually do go to test something.
When I'm processing evidence for the presence of latent prints, I am looking for ridge detail that's associated with your fingers, palms, and the soles of your feet. It's the elevated ridges that's on those fingers and soles and palms. So anytime that you touch an object, the sweat and oils from your fingers could be left on top of an object, and so it takes processing in order to make those visible. And so during that processing, I'm looking for those elevated ridges.
How are those prints developed?
The prints are developed in quite a few different ways. Depends on the type of object that I'm dealing with. That would afford me the opportunity to figure out which type of processing that I need. For a lot of the evidence that was in this case, I used non-porous processing. And non-porous processing or non-porous items are kind of what I described, where the print's going to lay on the top of that piece of evidence, such as plastic or metal or glass.
Now, since you brought up the glass, on the cell phone of lab exhibit 95A, what sort of material is that? Do you recall?
The front of the cell phone would have a glass cover over it, and then the back of the cell phone is more or less a flat surface. It can be considered plastic.
Now, with that, which, as I said earlier, has been previously admitted as Exhibit 177 to this trial, were you able to develop or identify any latent prints on that particular piece of evidence?
Yes, on Exhibit 95A, the examination revealed the presence of 2 identifiable latent fingerprints.
Scroll down a little bit further, Mr. Etheridge, please, to the next page. Down to the results, please. All right, a little bit further down, please. So in this section, thank you, that says comparison. How do you take a print that is developed and compare it to a known person?
To take a print that's been developed to compare it to a known person, I first take the known individual's information, such as their name and their date of birth. I will look up that information in the automated fingerprint identification system. It's called the APHIS system. And if there is a known individual that has that specific name and birth date, and they have a card on file, I will be able to then print off that fingerprint card. From there, I will look at the fingerprint card of all 10 fingers up against my unknown developed print, and I will look at them side by side to see if I see any characteristics that are in common with my unknown print to the known individual or the known fingerprint.
And in the case of with that cell phone, were you able to make a comparison of a print found on the back of that cell phone?
Yes, one of the prints I was able to make an identification.
And if you would, tell the jury about how that print was found and who it belonged to.
The print in question is what my report says is L06, so it's the latent number 6. And it was identified to the right index number 2 finger of Stephen Joshua Wiggins. And it was developed on the back cover of the cell phone from the driver floorboard of the Ford.
And then, as you just talked about this, but I want to be clear, the L06, latent 06, was that developed from the APHIS system?
As far as my identification,
Yes.
no, it was not.
Where was it identified from?
All I did was pull his fingerprint card, and I made the identification myself.
And where did you find the fingerprint card from?
The fingerprint card came from APHIS.
Thank you. Now, there's two other identifications, L04 and L05, that are from two other exhibits. If you would, let's talk about those. Specifically, L04 was developed from your exhibit 002, which was the Saturn LS. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And were you able to find a fingerprint of Stephen Wiggins on that vehicle?
Yes, L04 was identified to the right little number 5 finger of Joshua Stephen Wiggins, and it was from the front passenger exterior window.
And then in L05,
That was identified to the right middle finger, the number 3 middle finger of Stephen Joshua Wiggins, and it was developed from a Diet Mountain Dew bottle that was from the rear passenger floorboard of the Saturn.
we just talked about the cell phone in L06. And to be clear, that was found in the driver floorboard of the Ford.
That is correct.
If we could, let's discuss what's inconclusive about L07 and why it's inconclusive.
So, as far as latent prints is concerned, an inconclusive conclusion can mean a few different things. One is that on the fingerprint cards, there's not enough area that has been recorded for the area that I have on the latent print. It could be that the area never, like if it's a palm print, that I don't have palms on file, so it would be inconclusive because I can't compare that. It can be inconclusive because the latent print is distorted, that I may not be able to make a complete identification. In this case, it was that the latent print was a very high tip area, so it's really high up on the finger, and that is not recorded on any of the fingerprint cards.
Thank you. And finally, in L08, if you would tell the jury about your findings for that particular print.
So L08 was identified to the left ring, or the number 9 finger of Stephen Joshua Wiggins, and it was developed from exhibit 001, which was the Ford. It was the exterior driver rear door.
And is that from the photograph we saw previously?
Yes, sir.
Now, did you attempt to retrieve prints from exhibits 50 and 51A, which are the high point pistol and the Glock 33 pistol?
Yes, sir, I did.
Were you able to obtain any prints from there?
No, I was not.
Were there any other significant findings from your report?
There were other latent prints, and they were identified to other individuals.
Now, let's talk about that. So these other individuals, how did you, I guess, come into contact or to know that they may have their prints on a particular piece of evidence?
When I developed all 8 latent prints, I originally compared them to Joshua Stephen Wiggins, Erica Ann Castro Miles, and Daniel Scott Baker. I then made those comparisons and made identifications. The remaining latent prints that I was unable to identify, I searched them through the APHIS database, and I was able to get a correlation, and so therefore I had an individual's state identification number. I had an image, and I was able to make an identification and be able to find who that person or who that state identification number belonged to.
And who did you determine that these prints belonged to?
There was one print that belonged to a Jeffrey Ross McLeese, my apologies, and 2 prints were identified to Todd Everett Heath.
And where were the prints to Mr. McLeese and Mr. Heath found?
Mr. Heath's prints were found on the upper interior passenger front door
Of which vehicle?
of the Ford.
Okay. And then what about with Mr. McLeese?
Mr. McLeese was found on the same door as the Stephen Wiggins.
Thank you very much. See if you recognize this document.
Yes, it appears to be a copy of my report.
Is that what we've been looking at up here?
Yes, sir.
Ask that that be made the next exhibit, Your Honor.
192.
And I'll pass the witness.
Cross-examine.
No question.
Thank you, Agent. You may step down. You are released from your subpoena.
Thank you, Your Honor. And I'll give this one back to you as well.
Yeah, I just wanted to make sure with that. Miranda. Okay, drink that. Does she need water? She has. We weren't going to give you any secondhand water to take your medicine with. We were going to give you a fresh bottle if we needed to. So. All right. We're ready for the next witness.
Your Honor, say to call Agent Kyle Osborne.
Agent, if you'll step right up here, raise your right hand and face our clerk, please.
Do you solemnly swear or affirm the testimony you give in this case be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Afternoon, Agent.
Good afternoon.
If you would state your name for the court, please.
Kyle Osborne,
And if you would spell your last name, please.
Osborne.
And Agent Osborne, what do you do for a living?
I'm employed at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation Nashville Crime Laboratory as a forensic scientist assigned to the microanalysis unit.
Specifically, the microanalysis unit, what do you do?
So within that unit, I do testing involving glass comparisons, gunshot primer residues, chemical unknowns, and headlamp analysis, I suppose.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Agent, do you recognize that document?
Yes, sir, I do.
And if you would, let the jury know what you're looking at.
This appears to be a copy of my CV.
And if you would, let's start at the top. It discusses your education, correct?
Yes, sir, it does.
And what degrees do you have?
So I have a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Vanderbilt University, as well as a master's of science in chemistry from the Georgia Institute of Technology.
And then as far as your employment, we've discussed that you work for the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation. How long have you been there?
So I've been employed at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation for just about 7 years now.
And what did you do before that?
Before that, I was a teaching assistant at Georgia Tech while I was doing my graduate work, but those are the only employment that I have.
What sort of training do you have in order to be a special agent with the crime lab with TBI?
So in addition to my formal education, after getting hired at the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation, for each area that I do testing in, I undergo an in-house training. So for example, for analysis of gunshot primer residues, I did a year-long training that involved reading the scientific literature that's peer-reviewed published articles out in the scientific community, as well as doing projects looking at how gunshot residue is formed, how those samples can be analyzed to find gunshot primer residue, and how gunshot residue is deposited and remains on articles of clothing. Did supervised casework and competency tests. All of this accumulated in a mock case showing that I could do the required testing and get appropriate results.
Thank you. Mr. Osborne, have you ever testified as an expert before?
Yes, sir, I have.
In what areas?
I've testified in the areas of microanalysis, glass comparisons and direction of force, gunshot primer residue identification, and general chemical unknowns.
Thank you. Now, before we move any further, in this particular case, what sort of work did you actually do?
So in this particular case, I analyzed items of evidence that were submitted to the laboratory, processed them for gunshot residue, some of them, and looked for those residues, as well as I processed samples that had been previously collected for gunshot primer residue.
Your Honor, we'll tender the Agent Osborne as an expert in gunshot residue.
Any objection?
No objection.
All right, he'll be tendered as, be qualified rather, as by the court as an expert in microanalysis and gunshot residue.
Thank you. As part of your job with TBI, are you also a member of the violent crime response team?
Yes, sir, I am.
And how long have you been with VCRT?
I've been serving on the violent crime response team for, I would say, approximately 5 years now.
When you're called out as part of VCRT, what are your typical duties?
So typically, as part of the violent crime response team, in addition to the normal duties of documenting, photographing, taking a good representation of the scene, I specifically look forward to collect and preserve evidence related to microanalysis or the trace evidence unit.
And in this case, did you respond with the VCRT on May 30th of 2018 to Dixon County?
Yes, sir, I did.
If you would, describe for the jury what you did that day.
So on that day, I responded to the scene and assisted the collection and documentation of the scene. In addition, at one point along the side of a road were potential shoe impressions that I documented and casted for further analysis at the lab.
When you say documentation, you assisted with documentation, what do you specifically mean?
Specifically, that would be photographing mostly the areas where the evidence would be located.
May I approach the witness, Your Honor?
You may.
Agent Osborne, if you would, can you recognize this document?
Yes, this is a copy of my official microanalysis report for my gunshot primer residue testing.
Now, if you would, explain to the jury what gunshot primer residue is.
When a gun is fired, the first thing that has to happen is the trigger is pulled. When this occurs, it's going to set off a chain reaction that's eventually going to lead to the projectile leaving the end of the barrel. But the first step in that chemical reaction that's going to cause that burning and that projectile to escape the barrel is going to be either the hammer, in the case of something like a revolver, or the firing pin in the case of a pistol to strike the primer on the back of a cartridge. So when this occurs, in that primer are going to be a mixture of chemical compounds. And those chemical compounds are going to contain elements like antimony, barium, and lead. And these are three relatively heavy metals that aren't really present in most of our day-to-day lives. So when the primer or the firing pin strikes that primer, the force is going to cause those chemicals to start to burn very intensely. And that intense burning is going to send a flame into the gunpowder to then burn the gunpowder and eventually force the projectile out of the barrel. But as those chemicals burn up, they're going to turn into a gas and they're going to expand very rapidly. When that happens, they're going to try to escape the weapon in any way they can because they've built up so much pressure. So some of the ways they can escape is out of the end of the barrel. They can also escape through any small little gaps or openings in the weapon. So gaps around the trigger, or in the case of a semi-automatic, when the weapon cycles and the ejection port is open, any small little gaps, those gases are going to escape. When they do, those gases still contain those three elements, the antimony, barium, and lead. And as they expand, they're going to cool very quickly. When that happens, they're going to condense into small microscopic particles that are going to slowly fall in the area around where that gun was fired. Those small particles are going to look like they've condensed from a vapor, so they're going to be rounded, and then they're going to contain those three elements that I've been talking about, the antimony, barium, and lead. When we do the analysis, we are looking for those small microscopic kind of round particles that have antimony, barium, and lead. And those are particles from a firearm being discharged.
Now, in general, is there any way to quantify or know how much these particles, how far they'll spread in an area?
There have been studies to that effect, and in perfect conditions, indoors, without wind, to the sides of a gun being fired, they can spread anywhere, from 6 to 9, 10 feet. But downrange, they can go much further and tend to follow the trajectory of a bullet. However, atmospheric conditions like wind, humidity, all of those things can greatly affect where those particles can be deposited because they are settling out of the air. Something like wind could blow them one way or another.
Now, Agent Osborne, on May 30th, did you respond to the scene at Tidwell Switch and Sam Vineyard Road as part of VCRT?
To be honest, I believe I did, but those are not the notes that I have in front of me, and that was...
What I'm getting at is the Saturn. There's a Saturn, 98 Saturn at that scene. Based on what you just said, if someone is sitting inside of a car and a gun goes off, where would you generally expect gunpowder residue to disperse to?
So generally, if a weapon was fired inside of a vehicle, given the range that those can spread, I would not be surprised to find it all throughout that vehicle. These types of residues are not just primarily on the person firing the weapon, but they can be on people around them. It is a range that they can end up on.
Madam Clerk, if I could see Exhibit 121. And while she's getting that, there are a number of items that you tested, Agent Osborne. If you would go through those items, and if you can tell us how you came to be in possession of them.
So for each of these items, are there any in particular you'd like me to cover, or just all of them?
Just briefly in general, I guess what I'm asking is, did somebody from TBI collect each of these items that you tested?
Yes, so each of these items would have been collected by someone prior to me getting them. Each of these items would have been transferred to me within the laboratory.
Thank you. Now, previously, Agent Miranda Gaddis testified at trial, and she testified about collecting this next exhibit that I'm going to hand to you. See if you can identify it, please. You recognize that item?
Yes, I do. So this is our lab exhibit number 58, and it would have been gunshot residue stubs collected from the Saturn.
What are collection stubs?
So when GSR is collected, because it is just these small microscopic particles that end up on clothing or skin, we use a small aluminum disc with an adhesive layer on the top of it to basically tab the areas that may have gunshot residues, and the sticky nature of the stub is going to pick up those residues for analysis at the laboratory.
And so, once you get these stubs, what do you do with them? Do you have to do anything to process them in order to come to a conclusion?
So once I have these in the laboratory, I'll write up the packaging, document everything about the samples, and then those small stubs will be coated with a very thin layer of carbon to aid our analysis. And then they are examined using a specialized microscope that lets me both see the shape of the particles as well as their chemical composition.
So in this particular instance with these stubs, what conclusions were you able to come to? Thank you.
So for the stubs from the Saturn, my analysis showed that there were particles identified as gunshot primer residue on those stubs.
Now, with gunshot primer residue, are you able, is it even possible for you to tell which gun this residue came from?
So because primer composition is fairly uniform, there are small changes, but not a lot of major ones, as well as because of memory effects of the gun. Residues produced from a weapon or ammunition can't be matched back.
So basically, what can you tell from your tests?
So when gunshot primer residues are found, it indicates that the exhibit was, if it was from, say, a vehicle, that this vehicle was near a gun when it was fired or came in contact with a recently fired gun or ammunition components. It doesn't say, right, like you were saying, that that the residues had to have come from a particular gun, only from a gun that had been fired.
Now, with gunshot residue, is it a delicate matter, or can it withstand weather or washing or anything of that nature?
Gunshot primer residues are of a fairly delicate state. They are pretty easily removed by washing, rinsing, wiping. All of those things will remove some, if not most, of the present particles.
Thank you. You already asked that the report from Agent Osborne be made the next exhibit.
193.
Now, were there other items that did in fact test positive for gunshot residue based on your analysis?
Just a moment. There was one other item, Exhibit 3A, that did test positive.
And what is 3A for the lab?
So Exhibit 3A would have been the pink jacket from Erica Castro Miles.
And it tested positive for gunshot residue as well.
Yes, sir, it did.
I'll pass the witness, Your Honor.
Any questions, Mr. Evans?
Yes.
Afternoon, Agent Osborne.
Good afternoon.
My name's Luke Evans. I'm just going to have a few questions for you, okay? So, if I'm reading your report correct, the pink jacket from Erica Castro Miles tested positive for gunshot residue. Is that right? That's 003A?
Yes, sir.
Okay. What does it mean when you say, because of these results, down at the very bottom of the report, Exhibit 6A was not fully processed, and Exhibits 4A, 5A, and 7A were not processed?
So for items of clothing that come from one person, once I have gunshot primer residue on one item of clothing, There is no additional weight scientifically that can be applied to finding it on other articles of clothing from the same person. So for efficiency's sake, they would not be fully tested.
Okay, and then on page 2, you address exhibits, 53 through 56A, which are essentially the clothes. It says shirt from Stephen Wiggins, jeans from Stephen Wiggins, basically the clothes worn by Stephen Wiggins.
Yes, sir.
And what was your finding as to those clothes?
So for exhibits 53A, 54A, and 54B, which are the shirt, jeans, and belts from Stephen Wiggins, I did not find the presence of gunshot primer residue particles. And then for exhibits 55A, B, and C, and 56A, which are the shoes, underwear, socks, and backpack from Stephen Wiggins, those were not processed due to them either being covered or the amount of time and the conditions that they had been through prior to coming into the lab.
Okay, so a decision was made, you had information prior to saying exhibits 55A, B, C, and 56A, there's no sense in even processing these because I know that based on time or condition that they can't even be tested.
Right, that results by them would not be illuminating, yeah.
All right. However, you did feel that the 53A, 54A, 54B still warranted testing, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. Now, the first paragraph on this page talks about Exhibit 58A, and of course, that's what you talked about was the stubs from the interior of the Saturn, that they had tested positive. And then underneath that, it says, because of these results, additional samples were not completely processed as to Exhibit 57A was not processed, excuse me. So 57A was clothing from rear seat of Saturn. So can you explain to the jury why those clothes from the rear seat of the Saturn weren't processed?
So similarly to finding residues on one article of clothing and not testing the rest from the person, with 57A clothing that was in the vehicle, since I had identified gunshot primer residues from within the vehicle, finding more residues in the vehicle would not have added.
All right, and based on your area of expertise and the scope of that expertise, can you say whether or not a gun was fired from inside the vehicle definitively?
No. So with my area of expertise and the analysis of gunshot primer residues, I can say that they were present and that could have happened from a gun being fired in the vehicle, but it could also have happened from the surfaces coming in contact with a fired weapon. There are other ways that those could have gotten there.
Thank you.
Redirect?
No, Your Honor.
Thank you, Agent. You may step down and you are released. You may call your next witness.
Your Honor, the state would call Agent Shelly Carman.
I'm just gonna set this here for now. Stand here, face the clerk, and raise your right hand.
You solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony you give in this case be the truth, the whole truth, nothing but the truth, so help you God?
I do.
Good evening. If you would state your name for the court, please.
Shelly Carman,
If you would spell your last name, please.
Carman.
Agent Carman, who do you work for?
I'm employed by the Tennessee Bureau of Investigation at the Crime Laboratory in Nashville.
I'm a special agent forensic scientist supervisor assigned to the firearm and tool mark identification unit.
May I approach the witness, Your
You
Honor?
may.
Agent Carman, do you recognize the document I handed you?
I do.
And what is that document?
It's a copy of my CV or my professional career details
So how long have you been with TBI?
since 1990, for 31 years.
And so how long have you been the supervisor?
Since 2011, so 10 years.
What's your educational background?
Have a Bachelor of Science degree in chemistry from Belmont University in Nashville. I majored in chemistry, minored in biology. My training to be a firearms examiner was an on-the-job training program at the TBI crime lab, and that lasted 2 years, and I followed the guidelines established by the Association of Firearm and Tool Mark Examiners. During that 2-year training program, I did extensive background reading and research, prepared and presented papers on the topics that are important in the field of firearms identification, such as the history of the science of firearms identification, the history and development of firearms and ammunition. Had the opportunity to tour firearm and ammunition manufacturing plants across the country to see firsthand how firearms are manufactured, because it's during the manufacturing process that unique markings are left on the firearm, which make it possible to identify a bullet or a cartridge case that's being fired in that firearm. I disassembled, reassembled hundreds of firearms to see the different types of actions that you might encounter in firearms, also to learn the different safety features that might be there. During my training program, I also was trained to do tool mark analysis, where I compared any kind of tool to anything that it might come in contact with and leave a mark on. I was trained to restore serial numbers that had been obliterated. I also was trained in chemical testing of clothing to determine how far away from the front of the gun or the muzzle of the gun the person was when the gun was discharged. And I was trained and was on a crime scene team for 25 years, where I documented and collected firearms evidence.
In May of 2018, were you part of the VCRT?
I was not.
And so were you just solely at the lab?
Yes, I was on this case.
Now, we talked a little bit about your training as far as firearms and identification. Could you tell me a little bit more about your training and what it takes to become an expert in tool marks?
Tool marks is almost the umbrella that includes firearms identification. A tool, when it comes in contact with the surface and force is applied, can leave its markings on the softer surface of the that it's acting on. And the reason that does this is when tools are manufactured, different processes are used, and those tools that are making the actual tool itself are constantly undergoing random microscopic changes. They're wearing out a little bit. Sometimes molten metal sticks to the tools that are creating the tool surfaces. And all of those random microscopic changes to the surface of the tool that's being made will be transferred to the item that it acts on and marks.
In this particular case, well, actually, we do this. Your Honor, the state would tender Agent Carman as an expert in firearms and tool marking.
Okay.
Should be qualified as an expert in that field.
Thank you, Your Honor. In this particular case, as it pertains to tool marks, did you collect any evidence yourself?
I did.
What did you collect?
I collected the interior driver's side door handle from the Saturn, and also a pair of pliers that were in the driver's floorboard of this same Saturn.
May I approach the witness,
You
Your Honor?
may.
Agent Carman, if you wouldn't mind, first identifying what's in there and then opening the package.
Okay, I can identify this. It has my laboratory number, the barcode stickers with my exhibit number and the description of the evidence. This is also the packaging that I collected the pliers in. I did the labeling on it, and it has the evidence tape that I placed onto the packaging after I completed my analysis. And these I can identify as the pliers that I collected from the Saturn and also examined because they have the laboratory number, the exhibit number assigned to these, and my initials.
Thank you, Agent. I'm going to hand you a photograph, if you would, see if you recognize this photograph on it.
I have seen this photograph. I did not take this photograph.
Okay, do you recognize what it is, though?
It's a photograph of the Saturn, and you can see the pliers in the floorboard beside the Fanta bottle.
Is this the same photograph that you see up here on the screen?
It is.
Thank you. Now, I'm going to move the photograph, that particular photograph, in as the next exhibit.
194.
Thank you. Do you recognize what's in that photograph?
I do.
And if you would, is that the same that's on the screen here?
It is, and it's just a more close-up view of the same pliers by the Fanta bottle.
I'll ask that that be made the next exhibit, please.
195.
Yes, sir.
And the pliers that you just showed the jury, are those the same ones that are in these photographs?
They are, that you can see they have the yellow on the inside of the handles and the black grip, and then the slip joint with the bent neck.
Now, I'm going to ask that we make the pliers the next exhibit, but then, if Madam Clerk, if you'll hand that back to Ms. Carman when you're done.
Just the bag.
You did wanted to make this 196, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
Now, Agent Carman, when you were doing these tests, were you aware of the significance of the pliers in this case?
I was aware that there was a statement made that pliers were necessary to open the door of the Saturn.
Okay. You would identify on the packaging what that item is?
And this would be the interior door handle from the Saturn that I collected from the Saturn. Again, I can identify it with my description of what it was, what was contained inside. Then it has my laboratory number and the barcode with my stickers, my initials, and it's been filled with evidence tape that I placed on it after I completed my analysis.
If you would, please open that and show the jury what that is.
This is the interior door handle. This is the lever that you would pull to open the door from the inside of the vehicle. And it would have been on the driver's side.
And how did you remove that? Brute force, pry it out, or?
I believe it was more technique maneuvering it out than actual brute force.
Okay. We'll ask that that be made the next exhibit.
197.
Yes, sir.
Hand you that document. Agent, do you recognize that document?
I do.
And what is that document?
It is a copy of my official firearms report that I generated upon completion of the testing on this case.
Now, in this report, did you find conclusions about the pliers and that interior door handle?
I did have a result on the door handle comparison with the pliers.
Okay, so on your report, is the interior door handle then Exhibit 143A on the lab report?
It is.
And then the pliers would then be 142A, is that correct?
Yes.
Mr. Etheridge, if you go to the top of page 3, please. That's good, thank you. Agent Carman, if you would discuss with the jury the findings of your examination and how you arrived at those conclusions.
Okay, the the official findings on my report are examination of Exhibit 143A, which is the door handle, failed to reveal the presence of tool marks. No examination was performed on the pliers in Exhibit 142. And to come to that conclusion, I did a visual examination of the door handle, and what I was looking for are markings that I could use to compare to the pliers. I didn't see anything visually when I first looked at it, so I looked at it under a microscope so that I had a magnified image to look at. And I didn't see, and there's some wear on these and maybe some scratches, but I didn't see an area with tool marks that I thought was sufficient to compare to test tool marks that I could have made from the pliers.
Thank you. If we'd have the lights turned back on, and Agent, I'm going to ask if there's no objection that you would show the jury so they can have a better visual of what that door handle looks like. If you'd mind walking it in front so they can see it, please.
This is the door handle, and if you were sitting in the driver's seat, it would be like this, and then you would open it by pulling the handle, and this is the lock. So it would be like up here, and then you open it, maybe probably open it through that one. And it does move a little more freely than it did in the car, since it's been removed.
Thank you, Agent. I'm going to turn our attention to the bulk of your report. Actually, if you wouldn't mind, hand that back to the clerk when you're done putting things back away.
The report or
The other two exhibits. Clear them out of your way. Thank you. Agent, let's turn our attention to firearm identification. That's a really broad term, I'm sure, to you, just firearm identification, right?
It is.
So if you would educate the jury and me, for that matter, on everything that you can test with firearms.
Okay, if I receive, a typical case for me would be to receive a firearm and any number of fired bullets and fired cartridge cases, for me to examine to determine whether those bullets and cartridge cases had been fired in that firearm. I might also have some ammunition submitted with the firearm, and my report is going to call any single unit of ammunition, is going to refer to that as a cartridge. That's an unfired round of ammunition. A lot of people call those bullets. When I refer to bullets today, what I'll be talking about is the bullet that comes out of the barrel when the gun is fired. But typically I receive a firearm, bullets, and cartridge cases for comparison. The first thing I do is I examine the firearm, I document it with photographs, I write down everything that the make, the model, the serial number, the caliber, anything that's unusual about it, what kinds of safeties it has, what kind of action it has. I take measurements, I perform a trigger pull analysis, I make sure that that firearm is safe for me to fire, and then I fire test fires into a bullet recovery tank, and that's just a big water tank. I recover the fired bullets from the water tank, and the water will stop the bullets without imparting any markings onto the bullets. I recovered the fired bullets and the fired cartridge cases that I fired in that firearm. Those are going to be my known standards that I'll look at. And when I look at those under a comparison microscope, I can see two bullets or two cartridge cases side by side through one eyepiece, so I can see the markings that are left during the firing process on those fired bullets and fired cartridge cases. Once I have identified what types of markings that firearm leaves, then I'll look at the evidence bullets and cartridge cases and see if they have those same markings. If they do, then I can conclude that those bullets and cartridge cases had been fired in that firearm. If they don't have the same markings, I might have an elimination, or I might have, in between an elimination and identification, is a range of inconclusives.
Thank you. So these blanks that you compared to, the rounds that you have fired into the water tank and that you then compare, are those then compared to items collected from crime scenes?
Yes.
Madam Clerk, if I could see Exhibits 89 and 160, please. Now, Agent, the envelope that was just handed to you, do you recognize that?
I do. Again, it has the laboratory number, the barcode stickers with my exhibit number, my initials, and the evidence tape that I placed on it and initialed after I completed my analysis.
Can you tell what that piece of evidence is?
I can. It is my exhibit 48A, which is the fired bullet from the right arm of Daniel Baker.
Thank you. Now, Exhibit 160 there in the white box, do you recognize that item?
I do. Again, it has the laboratory number, the barcodes with the exhibit numbers, my initials, and evidence tape that I placed on it after my analysis.
Now, Agent, if you would, let's take the item that's within the white box out. And as make sure it's safe and clear.
There's a cable tie in the action of the pistol that I placed in it after I completed my analysis, but I have made a visual examination, felt in the barrel and also down the magazine well, and it's clear and empty.
Thank you. Now, I guess the simple question is, how can you tell that the bullet in Exhibit 89 was fired from the gun, the high point handgun in Exhibit 160?
Okay, I did the same process with this firearm when it was submitted to me. I determined that it's a high point model JHP 45 auto caliber pistol, and the serial number on it is X4308934. It was in it was in operating condition. The trigger pull on this was a little bit gritty, and the barrel was rusted when I received it. But it was in operating condition. I test fired it, and I looked at the test fired bullets versus the bullet from his arm. When I first received this, though, like I said, the barrel was rusted upon receipt, and I attempted to clean the barrel as much as I could. I don't know if it's still, well, you can't tell now that it was rusted, but it was completely full of rust on the edges, on the rims of the barrel. I cleaned that the best I could, and then I shot my test fires. When I looked at those bullets under the microscope, I could see an excessive amount of striations on the bearing surface of the bullet. So I knew that the rust had caused some damage to the barrel. That's not what bullets typically look like when they're fired through a barrel. These were covered with striations that were larger than we normally see, and just covered. They just covered the surface of the bullet.
Now, Agent Carman, what are striations?
There's scratches that are placed on the bullet as the bullet travels through the barrel. And if there's an imperfection in the barrel, if it's a dot or a raised area, when the bullet travels down the barrel, because the bullet's moving, that's going to show up as a scratch on the side of the bullet. That's a striation. So that's what I look at. Typically, bullets have most of the striations on the base of the bullet when they're fired. The bullets that I test fired in this were all along the sides of the bullet. So there are a lot more striations, a lot deeper, grosser striations than I typically see on bullets that I fire through the barrel.
And so in this particular case with your lab exhibit 48A and exhibit 50A, what conclusions were you able to come to?
The bullet from Daniel Baker had the same class characteristics as this pistol. And what I mean by class characteristics, that's the number of grooves that are cut into the barrel during the manufacturing process And those grooves are cut in a spiral motion, so that as the bullet travels down the barrel, it's gonna pick up that spin, and when the bullet exits the barrel, it's gonna be spinning in flight. That's gonna give stability and accuracy to the bullet as it travels downrange. This manufacturer cut 7 grooves into this barrel with a left-hand twist. That's pretty uncommon for .45 auto caliber firearms. When I ran this through the database, this was the only type of firearm that came up with those rifling characteristics. Those are the same rifling characteristics that I found on this bullet, but the individual characteristics, those that result from the manufacturing process, those that might have been obscured from the rust in this barrel, didn't match. But the 7 grooves with the left-hand twist, which is what's in this firearm, those were the same.
Why is that? Why the difference that you're talking about there?
I believe it was the condition of the barrel, the rust in the barrel.
Now,
It could have been from a different gun, but the condition of the barrel was very, very rusted. The bullets that I fired through it were obviously not fired through a pristine barrel, so it could have been a different gun. It could also have been the condition of the barrel.
okay. Now, let's go through your report that you have here. The question I have is the bullets you use for the test firing, the rounds that you use for the test firing, where do those come from?
The reference collection that I have at the laboratory.
All right. Now, we've previously entered several exhibits that are cartridge cases that were found at, I guess, on the outdoors on the road at Tidwell Switch and Sam Vineyard Road, as well as cartridges that were found within the Saturn, specifically exhibits 9A, 10A, 25A, 26A, and then 60 through 63A and 66A. Did you, or were you able to make any comparisons of those particular cartridges with anything that you knew in this case?
Some of those exhibits are cartridge cases. It also had some unfired cartridges. I had 4 from a hotel room, and I also had, I believe, 1 from the Saturn. And the 7 fired cartridge cases that I had that had been fired, I also had 1 cartridge case that was separated from the bullet that had not been fired, the bullet that I had from Daniel Baker, and an unfired bullet from the Saturn. They were all consistent with Blazer brand .45 auto caliber ammunition. I don't know if that answers your question, but.
It is, thank you. Now, were you able to compare, I guess, well, let's do this. Let's look at your 4th paragraph of your results. The fired Blazer brand .45 auto cartridge cases. If you would go through and explain to the jury what your findings are here.
Okay, I had 7 fired .45 auto caliber cartridge cases from this scene. 4 were at the Tidwell Switch, Sam Vineyard Road area, and 3 were out of the Saturn. All 7 of those cartridge cases had been fired in this high point pistol that I was submitted on this case.
And how were you able to tell that?
Again, I looked at the test fired cartridge cases that I personally fired in this pistol, determined what markings are left by that pistol, and looked for those markings on the evidence cartridge cases. Those markings were the same, so I could conclude that those cartridge cases had been fired in this pistol.
And specifically, what sort of markings are you looking at?
I'm looking at markings on the breech face of the pistol, and that's the area that supports the head of the cartridge when the cartridge is fired, and it is the backward portion right here. This is the ejection port. The breech face, I know that you can't see it from here, but it's this part right up here. The firing pin comes through that, and it's the firing pin hitting the primer of the cartridge that causes the detonation of the cartridge and the gun to fire. So I looked at the breech face area, the firing pin, which causes the ignition of the cartridge, and also the extractor and ejector On this gun, the firing pin acts as the ejector, so I didn't have that, but the extractor markings, all of those match this pistol. So those cartridge cases were fired in this pistol.
Thank you. Now, we've already discussed the findings you have in the 5th paragraph on page 2 of your report, but I don't think one thing I didn't ask was your exhibit, lab exhibit 48A, which is the trial exhibit 89, was it a .45 caliber bullet?
It was. It's a .45 auto caliber bullet, the same type and design as was loaded in the unfired cartridges from the hotel room and from the Saturn, and also consistent with what would have been loaded in those cartridge cases that were fired.
And if you would, Agent, go through the remainder of your report as it pertains to the firearms and the cartridges.
I also had 2 other pistols submitted on this case. They were both Glock service weapons from Daniel Baker. Those were found to be in normal operating condition. One was a 9mm caliber Glock pistol, model 17, and the other was a .357 SIG caliber Glock pistol, model 33. So they both function. They were not linked to any of the evidence in this case, any of the fired evidence in this case. And I entered the Glock .357 SIG caliber pistol was recovered in the backpack with a high point pistol from Stephen Wiggins. And because that was not in possession of the deputy, or it was an unknown location for several days, I entered test fired cartridge cases from that Glock pistol and from this high point pistol into our NIBIN database. And that's basically just a database of cartridge cases from crime scenes and also cartridge cases that are test fired in recovered firearms to see if either one of those linked to any other crimes, and they did not.
Thank you. Now, I do want to talk about handgun barrels in general a little bit here. Are there different quality of manufacturers out there?
There is.
And what would you consider kind of the top of the cream of the crop type of barrel based on what you do for a living?
Well, they're going to be your higher cost firearms that are going to have the best manufacturing processes and the best coatings on the barrel that are going to last the longest, that are going to be your best shooting guns. So your H&Ks, your SIGs, your more expensive firearms.
Now the coatings, what do you mean by coating?
Well, it can also be the types of metals that are used in the barrel making process. Some barrels don't rust as quickly as others. This firearm seemed to rust rather quickly. I get guns a lot of times from the side of the road or that have been found in a field, and those barrels aren't in the same kind of condition as this was, and they could have been there for months or years. This one was extremely rusted for the amount of time between the shooting scene and the collection of this pistol.
Based on your understanding of the case, how much time had passed from the time of the shooting until it was recovered or taken into evidence by Agent Gooch?
A day or two. I'm not sure of the exact same timeline.
And so, in this particular case, the rust that's in this barrel, is it a function of quality, or what are we talking about?
It could be a function of quality. I actually called the manufacturer on that because it was unusual, and I talked to the owner of High Point, and he said that they didn't really put a coating on the inside of the barrel to prevent it from rusting. He wasn't that surprised that it happened that quickly, so that's the information that he gave me.
Not that surprised?
He wasn't that surprised that it happened. They're not treated for that, and they do come with oil in the barrel, but even the manufacturer recommends that you clean the oil out before you shoot it.
And so I guess the bottom line is, due to the quality of that particular barrel, it then had an extreme amount of rust compared to what you would normally see?
It did have an extreme amount of rust compared to what I normally see, and it probably was due to the steel alloy that they used to make the barrel.
Thank you. One moment, Your Honor. Pass it, Your Honor.
Mr. Evans?
Good afternoon, or evening now, I guess.
Good evening.
I just got a few questions. So, you talk about this rust that you found in the barrel of the High Point. Okay, you don't know how long that rust had been there. You can't really speak to that, I would imagine.
No, I don't know. I don't know how long it had been there.
And just to be clear, you test fired the Glock 357, correct?
I did.
And when you say it's in normal operating condition, does that mean if you put a live round in it and pull the trigger, it'll send a bullet out the end of the barrel?
It will.
Okay. Same thing for the High Point, regardless of the rust or not having rust. Was it in operating conditions such that if you put a live round in it and pull the trigger, a bullet's going to come out the other end of the barrel?
It did.
All right. Thank you.
Finally, Your Honor, ask that the firearms report from Agent Carman be made the
Mark
next
that as the
exhibit.
next exhibit. Ladies and gentlemen, I need to take up one matter outside of your presence. If you'll just pass over to the jury room for a moment, we'll hopefully be very quick. Is that 198?
Yes, sir. I was about to say it.
The jurors, I've had 3 different questions submitted by the jurors, all of which are relating to the same issue. So I thought I would, the first one Ms. Handed says, can we conclude that the driver's side door handle of the Saturn was operational and did not need the pliers to help open the door? Then I was handed one that said, did you try to open the door with the inner handle before removing the handle from the vehicle? And the third one was, the handle of the Saturn altered prior to technician's removal. Was the cable or rod connected or hanging out of the door panel? So we have 3 jurors who all had the same idea. So, Mr. Wyatt, you want to ask the questions of this witness and see what the response is? And if there's any objection, I'll be glad to consider it.
Yes, Your Honor. Agent Carman, did you open and close the Saturn door?
I didn't sit in the seat of the Saturn and open and close the door, but I did pull the latch.
Okay. And I guess, but the door handle was intact when you took it apart, correct?
It was.
Thank you.
What can I do with this? Okay, this next question, I think that will resolve that question. Mr. Evans, you have anything asking about this witness, about those questions regarding the door handle?
Well, if Your Honor's going to ask when the jury comes back in, I may have some follow-up questions.
All right, what I will do is I will ask this witness when we come back as to whether or not, you tried the handle and let you explain how you tried to handle, and was it, in your opinion, in operational condition? Was it, as far as you know, in operational condition, the interior door latch?
As far as I know, we did have an agent that tested that.
Okay, someone did test it?
Yes,
Were you present when it was tested?
I was.
All right, and did he open the door using the handle?
Yes.
Your Honor, we'll have an exhibit tomorrow to that effect through Agent Neese.
All right. Would you prefer then to have that issue resolved by that agent rather than have this?
She can answer.
I think she can answer what she observed, certainly, and we'll do that. Lastly, I've just been handed another question from the jurors. Any rust on the bullet found in Sergeant, well, they call him Daniel, but it's Sergeant Baker's arm? That you would not have analyzed the bullet that was removed from Sergeant Baker's arm during an autopsy, would you?
I did examine the bullet, but I didn't note any rust on that.
All right. And just for my own edification, was this rust that you found in this high standard, it's my understanding that difference in quality of the barrels can make a difference regarding how quickly a barrel could rust, but if the barrel was submerged in water for some period of time and then taken out, could that have accelerated if it had been submerged in water for some period of time and then taken out of the water? Would that have accelerated the rusting process?
Yeah, that would have initiated and accelerated it probably.
Okay. All right, then, if this is all we have left, then assuming that we can go ahead, is this our last witness for the day? All right, then we'll go ahead and bring the jury in, and I'll ask her those questions, and then we'll go from there. For the record, is there any objection for me asking those questions since they were jury questions? All right, ladies and gentlemen, I have had some questions submitted, that three of which are basically all related to the operational condition of the door handle on the interior of the Saturn vehicle. So I'm going to ask those questions of this witness. Agent, if you could, was there an examination of that handle of the interior driver's side door of the Saturn before it was removed?
There was.
And do you know whether or not did you personally try the handle?
I tried the handle. I didn't sit down in the vehicle and close the door and then try to open it. What I did was when the door was open, I checked the tension to make sure that it was connected.
To your knowledge, was there a test made of the interior door handle by anyone in your observation that would have indicated whether it was in working condition?
There was.
And can you tell us who did that and what you observed?
It was Special Agent Brant Holt. Actually had put on a clean suit to get in the vehicle, and I believe it was video recorded by Agent Neese at the time that he was doing it. And he was able to get into the car, open the door, close it, open the door again, close it. I believe he locked it and unlocked it a couple of times also. It was videoed, so.
All right, and it's my understanding that that evidence may be coming through another agent, but did you personally observe that test?
I was there during that testing.
Lastly, there was a question asked about, you testified about the rust in the barrel of that firearm. Did you make any examination of the bullet that was removed from Sergeant Baker's arm?
On any bullet that comes in, I do the same type of exam. I document the weight of the bullet, the diameter of the bullet, the lands and grooves, or the rifling characteristics that are present on the bullet. I also look for any contamination that I can see. On that bullet, I did not observe any contamination, so that would probably be, where if rust had been present on the bullet, I would have seen that.
All right. Now, ladies and gentlemen, those questions were submitted by the jurors. I discussed them outside of your presence with both sides, and there was no objection to me asking those questions. But please understand, those questions are simply being asked because one of the jurors, one of you had requested that the question be asked. Do not infer that I have any interest in that answer, or that I thought that was something that should have been asked at any point. My asking those questions was simply because a juror had requested them, and it was just agreed that it would be simpler for me to ask them than one of the lawyers. Now, I have some good news and some bad news. Which one you want first? The bad news is that this is our last witness, and thank you, Agent, you can step down, we are finished with you. This is our last witness for the day. The good news is that the state tells me they think they can conclude their proof tomorrow. Now, don't get too excited, because there are several stages that will go beyond that, so it doesn't mean we're going to be quickly finished. We still have several things that we'll have to do. So, but I think we are under the impression that perhaps late tomorrow afternoon, the state may be able to rest their proof. We will have several things that we'll have to still go through, so bear with us, but we've moved quickly through it, so I would appreciate your indulgence a little longer, and I would just remind you of my admonition and my instructions to please do not discuss this case with anyone or let anyone discuss it with you. We've indicated to him before that just out of a precaution, I think we're going to have all your meals provided for you in either this location or at Montgomery Bell, or some place that we can ensure that you are insulated from any outside contact. So as uncomfortable as that may be in some situations, hopefully we'll be able to get you fed and comfortable as quickly as possible. So we are finished then with the jury for today. Is that correct, gentlemen? Yes, sir. And ladies? All right, then, ladies and gentlemen, you may retire to the jury room, and we will see you tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock.
Thank you. Thank you. I have two CVs that we need. You ain't right, Wyatt, you're not making it.
These last two CVs were not made exhibits. Is that correct?
Sorry, I thought I did, yes, we asked to be made exhibits.
All right, we will make them as exhibits as, I don't think there's any question. We qualify them as experts, but we'll go ahead and mark them. The next two exhibits in order, which would be 199, will be which one?
The CV of Kyle Osborne.
We've been keeping the log, and we had the CD of Kyle Osborne marked as 187, and the CD of Shelly Carman marked as 189.
No.
Hmm? It's not what we have.
187 is the brown evidence bag that contains cartridge from glove box of the Saturn.
Let's do this, rather than belabor the point, let's go ahead and have you coordinate with our clerk, you and one of the defense team, come coordinate with our clerk, and let's make sure everybody's on the same page about what's exhibits. There's no problem with making these CVs a late file exhibit, because all of these witnesses were qualified as experts, and this is just a record-keeping situation. So, all right, then if you will just take care of that when we adjourn, that would be my preference. All right, so tomorrow morning at 9 o'clock we'll resume, and that's with our emergency room doctor. Is that what we expected, or you have someone else? All right. And then tomorrow, have we been able to speak with the judge and the other, or has there been any problem with coordinating the medical examiner?
Your Honor, I spoke with the judge, and he let me know that the case in Warren County had settled.
All right, so we don't have a problem with Dr. Lee then?
I have spoken with Dr. Lee and let him know that Wednesday afternoon problem.
What time are we expecting to have him here?
Your Honor, he has to work in the lab in the morning. I told him in the afternoon. I think that will.
All right. We will look forward to that. All right, thank you, ladies and gentlemen, and we will adjourn court at this time. Thank you.
All rise. This court adjourned.
Recording stopped.